The dog had already drawn blood twice that morning, and the handlers were starting to talk about putting her down. Nobody said it out loud, not yet, but the looks being exchanged across the training yard told the story clearly enough. Staff Sergeant Kevin Poulin had a bandaged forearm he was trying not to favor. Corporal Danica Hebert had stopped making eye contact with the animal entirely, and Major René Thibault, who had driven 3 hours from CFB Trenton specifically to assess the situation, stood at the edge of the chain-link fence with her arms crossed and her jaw set in the way that people who'd known her for years had learned to recognize. It meant a decision was coming. It meant she'd already started calculating outcomes. The dog's name was Frost. She was a 4-year-old Belgian Malinois, 70 pounds of muscle and scar tissue, and she had been the finest explosive detection animal the Canadian Armed Forces had fielded in over a decade. Her record was clean. Her instincts were extraordinary, and the soldiers who'd worked beside her in theater spoke about her the way they spoke about their best colleagues, with a kind of quiet private respect that didn't need explaining to anyone who'd been there. 14 months ago, her handler had been medically discharged. Since then, Frost had worked through 4 replacement handlers. Not one of them had lasted longer than 6 weeks. The 5th, Poulin, had made it 9 weeks before Frost took a piece out of his forearm during a routine leash transfer. The wound was clean, the vet said, controlled, which was almost more unsettling than if it had been frenzied. Frost didn't lose control. Frost made choices. That was the problem nobody could solve. Major Thibault had reviewed the reports, spoken to the veterinary behavioral team at CFB Borden, consulted 2 separate civilian dog trainers with decades of experience in military working animals. The consensus, delivered carefully and with appropriate professional hedging, was something she hadn't wanted to hear. Some animals bond with a single handler so completely that the relationship cannot be transferred, especially in cases where the original bond was formed early and deepened under high-stress operational conditions, especially in cases where the separation had been abrupt and without any gradual transition period, especially when the dog was, by every behavioral metric, grieving. Thibault didn't like that word in a military context. It felt imprecise, sentimental. But the behaviorist had been patient with her and had explained it again in the flat, factual language that she preferred. The dog's cortisol levels were chronically elevated. Her appetite had been irregular for over a year. Her sleep cycles were fragmented. She responded to novel stimuli with aggression rather than alertness. These were measurable, documented, physiological facts. The dog was in sustained psychological distress, and it was getting worse, not better, which was why Thibault had made a phone call she'd been putting off for 3 weeks, and why, at 11:17 on a gray Tuesday morning in October, a rusted blue Ford pickup truck with Manitoba plates turned off the main road and rolled slowly through the east gate of the training facility. The man who climbed out of the truck moved like someone who had spent years learning to move carefully. Not slowly, carefully, every step placed with intention, every action considered before it happened. He was somewhere in his mid-60s, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of weathered face that came from decades of outdoor work rather than outdoor recreation. He wore a canvas work jacket, worn at the elbows, and the kind of steel-toed boots that had never been near a fashion consideration in their entire existence. His name was Victor Lassantide. Most people in the small farming community of Ste. Genevieve du Lac, Manitoba, knew him as the man who kept to himself out on the Lasson property, about 14 kilometers east of town, where he ran a modest operation. Some cattle, a grain crop, a workshop where he fixed small engines for neighbors who asked nicely enough. He'd lived there quietly for about 6 years. He kept his grass cut. He returned his library books on time. He brought preserves to the community fundraiser in August. Nobody in Ste. Genevieve du Lac knew that, for over 23 years before he'd moved there, Victor Lassonde had been a senior intelligence operator attached to the Joint Task Force 2 support structure, running asset networks in environments that Canadian official records still categorized as undisclosed. Nobody knew, and he had taken considerable pains to ensure they never would. He stood beside his truck for a moment and looked at the training yard. Frost was at the far end, on a long lead attached to a ground anchor, lying down with her head on her paws. Even from this distance, something about the posture was wrong. Too still, too deliberate. The stillness of an animal conserving energy it no longer believed was worth spending. Lassonde looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached back into the cab of his truck and took out a small canvas bag, which he set on the hood without opening, and waited. Major Thibault met him at the gate. She had read his service record, what existed of it in accessible files, and had been struck by how little it actually said. There were dates, designations, a series of postings listed only by region rather than by specific unit or mission. There were commendations, 3 of them, each written in language so general as to be almost meaningless. There was a medical discharge notation from 7 years ago citing a joint condition in his left knee. And there was a file annotation, added recently by her own adjutant after 3 days of digging. See parallel file under operational security classification, access restricted, contact appropriate authority. She had not contacted the appropriate authority. She had called Lassonde directly. "Thank you for coming," she said, and extended her hand. He shook it once, without ceremony. "You said it was urgent." "It is. You also said you'd have tried everything else first." "We have." He glanced past her toward the yard. "How bad?" She told him honestly. 2 incidents resulting in injury. Sustained behavioral deterioration over 14 months. Veterinary team recommending a decision be made within 60 days. He didn't react, exactly, but something shifted in his face, a slight compression around the eyes, there and gone. 60 days, he said. That's the recommendation. He picked up the canvas bag from the hood of the truck and zipped it open. Inside was a single item, a length of woven leather lead dark with age and use, the brass clip at the end worn smooth. He looked at it for a moment, then looked up. "Where is she?" They cleared the yard of everyone except Thibault, who stayed near the gate, and the base veterinarian, Dr. Simard, who positioned herself at the far perimeter with a radio and the particular expression of someone prepared to intervene immediately, but hoping very much not to. Frost had not moved from her position at the ground anchor. Lassonde walked to the center of the yard and stopped. He did not call to the dog. He did not make any of the standard approach movements. No crouching, no extended hand, none of the techniques that the trainers had cycled through over the preceding months in varying combinations. He simply stood still, the old leather lead hanging from his right hand, and waited. For almost 2 full minutes, nothing happened. Then Frost lifted her head. She did not look in his direction immediately. She looked at the fence, then at the ground, then in a slow, almost reluctant arc, her gaze moved across the yard and found him. Nobody breathed. Frost's ears came up, not in the sharp, aggressive posture of a dog preparing to act. Something different, something that looked, to the people watching, almost like disbelief. She got to her feet. The lead attached to the ground anchor went taut as she stepped forward, and then taut again as she pulled harder, and then she was straining against it with her whole body, not in the frantic way of an animal trying to escape, but in the focused, purposeful way of an animal trying to get somewhere specific. Lassonde walked toward her slowly. He said one word quietly, not a command, just her name, Frost, and she sat down and shook, not trembled, shook, her whole body uncontrollably, as if something that had been locked down for over a year was being released all at once. She sat and shook and pressed her face against the front of his jacket, and he put one hand on the back of her head and stood there while she did it, not moving, not speaking. Dr. Simard, watching from the perimeter, later said she wasn't entirely sure what she was looking at from a clinical standpoint and wasn't sure that mattered. Thibault said nothing. She was not a person who cried easily, and she did not cry then, but it was a closer call than she would have admitted to anyone in her chain of command. They sat with her for a long time after that. Frost had curled against Lassonde's leg, one of his hands resting on her flank, her breathing slow, and even in a way that the daily monitoring logs had not recorded in over a year. Thibault sat across from him on a training block and waited until she felt it was reasonable to talk. "She found you in about 90 seconds, she said. 110, he said. I counted. She didn't respond to her name from any of the handlers we had tried. She responds to the person saying it." He didn't say this critically, just factually. "The name is a signal, not a command. She learned what it meant when I said it. It means something specific coming from me. From someone else, it's just a sound." Thibault absorbed this. The behaviorist tried to explain something similar. "Smart person." He scratched Frost gently behind the ear, and the dog's eyes closed. "She's not a machine. You can't transfer the user." The directness of it was not unkind, but it was not soft either. Thibault appreciated that. "I need to ask you something," she said. "I know what you're going to ask. Then I'll ask it anyway." She leaned forward slightly. What happened when you were discharged? The separation process, how did it go? A pause, a long one. It didn't, he said finally. Explain that. He looked down at Frost. The knee went in February. I was in hospital, then physio. No one brought her to see me during that time. I was told it was protocol, that animals in active service couldn't leave the facility during a handler's medical leave. I was told the transition would be managed. He paused again. I was discharged in June. I asked specifically about a formal separation process. I asked about the option to adopt her at end of service, which I'd been told was available for handlers in good standing. His voice remained even. I was told there was a waiting list. I was told she had been assigned to a new handler. I was told to submit a formal request and that it would be reviewed, and I submitted it 3 times. He looked up. I didn't hear back. Thibault held his gaze. She had read enough of the file to know this was likely accurate. She had also read enough of the file to know that the administrative failures he was describing were not unusual, and that this did not make them acceptable, and that the gap between those two facts was where animals like Frost ended up at the wrong end of a 60-day recommendation. I'm sorry, she said, and she meant it. He didn't brush it off, which she respected. He acknowledged it with a small nod and looked back at the dog. What happens now? He asked. That depends on several things. She chose her words carefully. Regulation permits adoption by former handlers who meet certain criteria. Given the animal's behavioral record, given what I've observed today, and given what I believe is in the best interest of the animal and the program, she paused. I'm prepared to fast-track that process, if you're interested. He was quiet for a moment. I've got 1,400 acres in Manitoba, he said. Some of it's fenced, most of it isn't. She'd have room. That wasn't actually my question. He looked at her then, and for a moment the careful, measured quality in his face shifted into something less controlled. Yes, he said. I'm interested. The paperwork took 11 days. Lassonde stayed near the base for most of that time, returning each day to work with Frost in the yard. There was no dramatic transformation. She didn't become the animal she'd been overnight, but the aggression stopped. The stillness stopped. She started eating regularly again, sleeping through the night, responding to commands with the clean, precise attention that her early training records described, and that her handlers over the past year had never once seen. Poulin came back to observe on the 4th day, his forearm still bandaged, and stood at the fence watching for about 20 minutes without saying anything. On the way out, he stopped beside Lassonde and said, I want you to know I don't take it personally, what she did. Lassonde looked at him steadily. Good, I did everything right. Everything by the book. I don't know what else I could have done. You didn't do anything wrong, Lassonde said. That's not what this was about. Poulin nodded slowly. Then what was it about? Lassonde looked out at Frost, who was lying in a strip of afternoon sun near the center of the yard, watching them both with the calm, unhurried attention of an animal that no longer needed to be on guard. She needed to know she hadn't been forgotten, he said. That's all. That's the whole thing. On the morning the paperwork was finalized, Dr. Simard brought the documents out to the yard, where Lassonde was running Frost through a loose set of off-leash exercises. Nothing formal, just the two of them moving together in the quiet October light, the kind of quiet that comes after something has been resolved. Simard set the folder on a training block, watched them for a moment, and said, Can I ask you something? Off the record. He stopped walking and looked at her. Sure. The behaviorist's report said she was grieving. The assessment said her bond was too strong to be reassigned. She paused. Why didn't someone call you sooner? He considered the question. Because grief in an animal is still easier to explain away than to address, he said. It's easier to cycle through handlers and call it a training problem. Easier to say the dog is aggressive and start the clock. He glanced over at Frost, who had trotted back to sit at his left heel without being asked. But she wasn't aggressive. She was waiting. There's a difference. Simard looked at the dog for a moment. Is there a way to prevent this? For other animals? Other handlers? Yes, he said. Don't end the relationship without a proper goodbye. Give them time. Give the animal a chance to understand what's happening. He shrugged. The small, pragmatic shrug of someone stating the obvious. It's not complicated. We just don't always make time for it. The drive back to Manitoba took 2 days. Lassonde drove the first stretch through the afternoon and into the early evening, stopping at a motel outside Sudbury where he'd called ahead to confirm they took dogs. Frost rode in the back seat with her chin on the center console, and her eyes tracking the road ahead the same way they used to track a path on a sweep through difficult terrain, steady, focused, alert, without anxiety. At the motel, he let her out in the parking lot, and she investigated the perimeter with the brisk efficiency of a dog who had decided, apparently, to get back to the work of being who she was. Then she sat beside him in the cool evening air and leaned her weight against his leg, and he stood there in the light from the motel sign for a while before going inside. The second day they crossed into Manitoba just before noon, the land flattening and opening up in the way it does when you come over a rise, and suddenly the sky takes up 3/4 of what you can see. Lasonde rolled the window down an inch, and Frost pressed her nose to the gap and held it there for the next 40 kilometers. He turned onto the gravel road that led to the property a little before 3 in the afternoon. The house was not much to look at from the outside. Plain, practical, the kind of structure built to function through prairie winters rather than to make any particular statement. The yard was tidy. The workshop at the back had its side door propped open. There was a stand of old poplars along the north edge of the property that he'd always thought about cutting down and never had. He stopped the truck and got out. Frost jumped out behind him and stood in the long, dry grass at the edge of the drive. She looked out at the field. The sky above it was enormous and pale blue and absolutely still. There was no sound except the wind moving through the poplars, and somewhere farther off, a hawk circling over the tree line. She looked back at him once. He nodded at the field. She ran. He watched her go, full speed across the open ground, ears back, the long, low stride of a working dog who has finally been given space proportional to what she'd always been built for. She ran until she was a small shape against the distant tree line, and then she turned and came back at the same pace, and arrived at his feet slightly out of breath, looked up at him with an expression. Whatever a scientist might have said about projecting human emotional states onto animals, looked plainly and unmistakably like joy. He crouched down. She pressed her forehead against his. He stayed like that for a long time. Some things don't need explaining. Some bonds don't break, no matter how long they're asked to wait. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the ones who got lost find their way home after all.